Nos acompañan el venerable Ajahn Sumedho. Ajahn significa maestro, y su asistente Bhikkhu Asoko. También me gustaría señalar que no soy traductor, solamente hablo un poco de inglés y participo en la sangha en que nos juntamos a meditar. Y voy a hacer una presentación de cada uno. I'm going to introduce you both. Bueno, el asistente del venerable Ajahn Sumedho es el venerable Bhikkhu Asoko. Él nació en Estados Unidos, nació en Nueva York, creció en Suiza, fue ordenado Bhikkhu, monje en Tailandia, y actualmente vive en el monasterio del bosque en Ratanawan, en el centro de Tailandia, junto al maestro Sumedho, y lleva 11 años ordenado monje. And I'm going to introduce you. El venerable Ajahn Sumedho, él nació en el año 34 en Seattle, en Estados Unidos. Se ordenó monje en la tradición Theravada, que dentro del budismo es considerada una de las líneas más antiguas. Se convirtió en el primer discípulo occidental de Luang Por Cha, más conocido como Ajahn Chah, en Wat Nong Pa Hong, en el noroeste de Tailandia. En 1975, el venerable Ajahn Chah lo envió a un pueblo cercano, Ban de Bong Wai, para establecer un monasterio al que iba gente de habla inglesa, y ya en el año 77 se instaló en el Reino Unido, y Ajahn Chah le solicita si podía concurrir a Londres, y se muda posteriormente a West Sussex y funda ahí el monasterio Chithurst. Luang Por Sumedho, Luang Por significa venerable padre. Eso es lo que significa la primera parte, venerable padre, y Ajahn maestro. Luang Por Sumedho ayudó a fundar varios monasterios en los últimos años, tanto en Inglaterra como en como en el extranjero, y unos años después de vivir en el monasterio Chithurst, se trasladó para establecer el Amaravati Buddhist Monastery en Hertfordshire. Luang Por ha vivido difundiendo la enseñanza del Buda, y es uno de los maestros, y esa es la gran oportunidad que tenemos hoy, más representativos de la tradición tailandesa del bosque, que es una tradición que pone mucho énfasis en la meditación. Y actualmente, bueno, dejó de vivir ya hace 4 años en el Reino Unido y está establecido en Wat Pa Ratanawan. Hoy nos va a hablar acerca de las 4 nobles verdades en la tradición budista, desde la tradición Theravada especialmente, y se va a hacer referencia a 3 discursos, o suttas, o sutras, como se dice en sánscrito: el Dhammacakka Pavattana Sutta, que es el discurso de la puesta en movimiento de la rueda de la doctrina; el Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, el discurso de la doctrina de la no entidad, el no yo; y el Aditta Pariyaya Sutta, el discurso del fuego. Los que se anotaron en la lista nos pueden escribir, solicitar. Nosotros les vamos a enviar estos 3 discursos que Bhikkhu Nandisena, un monje Theravada que reside en México, tradujo ya. So now I finished the introduction. You could understand with the talk about the Dhamma. Dhamma significa, tiene más de 200 significados, pero uno de esos es enseñanza. I said that Dhamma has many meanings, so one of the translations. I think so. Yes it is, I can hear.
This evening, I'm very happy to attend this meeting. I'm very hospitable, inviting us to attend this meeting here, and I cannot speak Spanish, so I depend on Andre to translate.
Dice que no habla español, pero va a depender de mí para esta traducción y que está contento de que estemos todos aquí presentes.
It's very good to see the interest in Theravada Buddhism here in Santiago. I was here about eight or 9 years ago, and there was...
It's not working. It's working. Please speak louder.
Is it working?
No, it's not working.
Is it on? Por mientras traduzco lo que él estaba diciendo, esta no es la primera vez que está acá, está súper contento de ver gente que se reúne en torno a los conocimientos de la tradición Theravada y que hace aproximadamente 8 años él estuvo aquí previamente.
Toda una paz.
Carola.
It could continue. Yes, yes.
I visited Chile about 10 years ago, and the Thai ambassador then was Ambassador Pitya. He arranged to meet with various Buddhist groups. I met with Tibetan groups and Zen groups. I gave a talk at St. Thomas University in Santiago, and but there was no Theravada at all. So I was glad to see in the website that Umberto and Andre and people have seen the value and given the opportunity to study and practice Theravada Buddhism.
Bueno, muchos de ustedes hacen meditación, por lo tanto esto no los perturba. Hace 10 años, cuando estuvo aquí, fue invitado por el embajador de Tailandia y él impartió charlas con grupos Zen, con grupos tibetanos y también en la Universidad de Santo Tomás, pero en aquel entonces no había ningún grupo Theravada, entonces ahora él está bien contento de que en la iniciativa de Humberto Barahona y Mane Becas esté dando fruto.
My first introduction to Buddhism was 60 years ago. The Zen Buddhism. I was in the United States Navy, and I encountered Zen Buddhism, translation of Zen Buddhist texts from Japanese to English in Japan, and that began. I was 21 at the time. I'm 81 now, so it's been 60 years of pursuing the interest initially in Zen, which eventually led to Theravada as I came to live in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, and in Thailand.
Bueno, entonces la primera aproximación que él tuvo con el budismo fue hace más de 60 años a través de la Armada norteamericana y conoció el budismo Zen y las traducciones que se hacían del japonés al inglés de los textos de esta tradición y más bien de un modo casual el budismo Theravada de la zona del sur de Asia, de los países del sur de Asia.
And the sutta that most attracted me right from the beginning, when I was, even before I became a fully ordained Buddhist monk. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Thank you. Was the original teaching after the Buddha's enlightenment in Bodh Gaya. He realized the truth ultimate truth, the Dhamma. But how do you explain the Dhamma with words? It doesn't depend on words. So the first thought he had was this: there's no way to teach this to anyone else. It's impossible. And then in the scripture, the Brahma God came down from the heavens and it said, there are those with only a little dust in their eyes, teach for the welfare of those people. So the Buddha left Bodh Gaya, went to meet his 5 colleagues, the Panchavaki, the 5 friends that had practiced together in Saranath. And there he delivered his first sermon, which is the sermon on the Four Noble Truths.
Entonces, lo que más le interesó, el sutta que más le llama la atención, el sutta o sutra en sánscrito, es discurso. Entonces el discurso del Buda que más le interesó es aquel primer discurso. El discurso tiene un nombre largo, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, y hace mención allí en Sumedho a lo difícil que es traducir el Dhamma, la enseñanza, y comprender que Brahma le dice al Buda, mira, esto lo tienes que enseñar. Entonces, y le insta en este sutta a sus 5 colegas, a sus 5 amigos, en la práctica del Dhamma.
So, and this is a unique teaching. There's no other religion that has a comparable teaching to the Four Noble Truths. And most religions start from metaphysical beliefs. This was where very high up, metaphysics is a matter of belief or interest, but you can't prove it. There's no tangible form of, say, a supreme deity. But so the Buddha established a teaching on something so ordinary, so common to all humanity, such as the common experience of dukkha or suffering. So this is taking something that we can all relate to. It doesn't depend on believing in the Noble Truth. It's not about you have to believe, because suffering is something we can all reflect on, and we all experience it.
Bien. Entonces, esta religión, espiritualidad, es única, y en la intención de explicar estas 4 nobles verdades, a diferencia de otras religiones, con un origen más metafísico en sus creencias, es algo más difícil de probar, porque es una deidad quien imparte una creencia. En tanto, el budismo te habla del sufrimiento, y nosotros no necesitamos fe para creer en el concepto del sufrimiento.
And suffering, of course, is what none of us want. We experience it in various ways, from just anxiety and worry to great traumas. But we are looking for happiness. And saying the average person is looking to find happiness and security, and suffering is something we want to run away from. So why did the Buddha make it into a noble truth? This is an interesting question. Why would he take something nobody likes or wants and put it in the position of the first noble truth?
Entonces está el concepto de sufrimiento que nos produce ansiedad, y en realidad nosotros lo que queremos es felicidad y un estado de seguridad, y el sufrimiento lo único que queremos es salir arrancando. Y aquí pasamos a la primera noble verdad.
And so I asked myself when I first read this sutta was, why would somebody take something you don't want? And then we all spend our life really trying to get rid of it, to making it into a noble truth. And this, of course, is changing the attitude from running away from suffering or blaming it on others to understanding it, because the Buddha said suffering should be understood. And to understand something, you have to accept it for what it is. If you're constantly running away or denying it or resisting it, then you'll never understand suffering. You'll merely develop a habit of trying to avoid rather than understanding. So this is a truth to be understood, meaning we start with ourselves. And then the teachers in Thailand, the Luang Por Chah, would point to the heart here, to understand here, not just the definition, of course, is easy enough to understand, but the reality of suffering is we must learn to accept and understand this sense of discomfort, disease, instability, insecurity, anxiety, or grief, sorrow, despair. And this is a way of the Buddha emphasized, to understand you must accept it for what it is.
Entonces, esta noble verdad, la noble verdad del sufrimiento, es más bien algo de lo que uno quiere huir, quiere escapar. Y lo que el Buda enseña es algo contradictorio, porque te está diciendo que la tienes que entender, que no la tienes que negar, que no te tienes que resistir. Y hay que entender este concepto enlazado a la inestabilidad. Y por esa misma razón el Buda dice, de esto que queremos huir es lo que tenemos que entender.
So this is how we do this, how we accept and understand suffering is of course the development, cultivation of mindfulness, or sati sampajanya, which is becoming an increasingly popular word in English-speaking countries. In the UK they use mindfulness now. You can teach it at Buckingham Palace to the staff. But of course, to understand suffering is not to define it, but to be aware of it, awaken to this inner feeling of disease or discomfort or whatever that we each can recognize in the present moment, here and now.
Entonces, para poder comprender lo que ocurre, está el cultivo del mindfulness, o de la atención plena. Y se ha puesto muy popular en el mundo y en el mundo occidental. Por ejemplo, en Inglaterra se le enseña a la gente que trabaja en el Palacio de Buckingham. Y no es acerca de entender el concepto, sino de reconocerlo. Y eso exige reconocer, poner atención en el momento, aquí y ahora.
So this understanding, then there's three aspects to each of the Four Noble Truths. So there's the statement, there's suffering, which is from the scripture, it's from the sutta, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta statement. Then the second aspect is what to do with suffering, is to understand it. It should be understood. And then through that, changing your attitude from running away, avoiding it, denying it, or just passively resigning yourself to misery, you're actually changing to look at it from sati sampajanya, from mindfulness, attention plane, and to which gives you a different perspective. It changes direction. There's something ennobling about it. That's why it's a noble truth, because instead of running from it, seeking happiness or blaming your suffering on others, you're actually using this common, ordinary experience that all human beings have since the first one to the present people here as something to learn from, to understand, to develop wisdom through accepting something that's true. Suffering does exist. It is what it is, and our relationship to it is to see it in terms of wisdom rather than through personal likes or fears or desires.
Entonces, comprender el sufrimiento tiene dos grandes aspectos y están descritos en el discurso de la puesta en movimiento de la rueda de la doctrina, que él lo dijo en lengua pali. Y entonces, las 4 nobles verdades que menciona el Buda son que está la noble verdad del sufrimiento, y en segundo lugar, comprender este sufrimiento y comprender el origen de este sufrimiento, y en tercer lugar, no salir arrancando de él, no evitarlo, sino observarlo de una perspectiva diferente y no verlo como que voy a seguir sufriendo, sino emplear esta observación como una noble verdad del sufrimiento y aceptarlo tal cual es, verlo en términos de sabiduría y no de un apego.
So the third aspect is rises and ceases, and so your relationship to it is you're developing the wisdom faculty through understanding things as they really are.
Entonces, hay que poner atención en lo que significa el sufrimiento y aceptarlo pacientemente y comprender su impermanencia y observarlo desde la sabiduría.
So that's why it is noble truth rather than a nasty fact of life. And mindfulness is the English translation of Sati Sampajanya, which is Pali language, and that means to pay attention, to be aware, awake. We take refuge in Buddha in the traditional Theravada form. When we take refuge in Buddha, we're taking refuge in awareness, in awakened wisdom, attention to the way it is in the present. And this is when we develop meditation. We're developing this ability, this aspect of our lives that tends to have been ignored or forgotten, especially in modern affluent societies.
Entonces, cuando comprendemos que el sufrimiento es una verdad y una verdad noble, pasamos al concepto del mindfulness, que es la traducción inglesa de un concepto en Pali, y que significa poner atención para poder finalmente despertar.
And
Very complicated to translate all that. Tricky concepts.
so this attention, attention plane, mindfulness, is the only possibility we have to understand Dhamma through insight, through wisdom insight, rather than trying to define Dhamma. Dhamma cannot be defined, has no boundary, but it can be known. And the knowing of Dhamma, ultimate reality, is through mindfulness. That's the door, the gate that we have in our lives, in our consciousness, to connect, to recognize and know for ourselves ultimate reality or the Dhamma.
Entonces la atención plena se conoce a través de una sabiduría insight, de introspección, y esto puede ser a través de conocer el Dhamma, que voy a traducir como enseñanza, es a través del desarrollo de la conciencia.
So then the First Noble Truth is to be understood. The second one is the cause of suffering, or the origin of suffering, of dukkha. And that is caused through this ignorance of Dhamma, not knowing the Four Noble Truths. Avijja is the Pali word, not understanding reality. We grasp desires, and these grasping of desires is the cause of our suffering. Out of ignorance and grasping of desire, we create this sense of there's something wrong, there's separateness, loneliness, this sense of fear of death, fear of what others think. The whole realm of dukkha arises through this blindness, this ignorance, and this helpless grasping of desire.
Entonces aquí tenemos que comprender la segunda noble verdad, que es el origen de este sufrimiento, y el origen del sufrimiento es la ignorancia, y ser ignorante desde esta perspectiva es no comprender la realidad, para poder entender que los deseos, los apegos, es lo que nos causan este sufrimiento, y esta ignorancia que es dukkha es lo que nos hace sentir estos miedos, este miedo a la muerte, por ejemplo.
So desire, they use the Pali word danha. Danha is the word for desire. And in English the word desire always kind of is negative. It's something not very nice. But the realm that we live in is a desire realm. Our bodies are desire forms. We see, we have eyes, ears, nose, tongue. We have a physical body and a mind that is based on desire, on attaining, on achieving, on controlling, getting what you don't have, trying to get what you don't have, or trying to desire to get rid of things you don't like as desire. Or just sensory desire, just seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching through the senses, and desiring what is pleasing to you, or wanting to get rid of or run away from what is displeasing to your senses. So this realm of desire that we're in, as long as there's avijja, or ignorance, of the Four Noble Truths, then the result will always be some sort of dukkha, or suffering.
Bueno, el deseo en inglés tiene una connotación negativa, pero muchas formas están deseadas. El cuerpo, nuestra mente desea cosas, y nosotros queremos oler cosas agradables, queremos sentir cosas agradables, y queremos evitar las cosas que no son desagradables, queremos salir corriendo de ellas.
So there's three kinds of desire listed in the Second Noble Truth, Kama and Tanha, which is sensual desire through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body. Then there's Bhava Tanha, which is the desire, like ambition, desire to become something or get something you don't have. It can be ambition, or it can be desire. It can be a good desire to be enlightened, desire to become an arahant, or whatever is bhava dhamma, or desire for becoming. And then the third is Vipavadana, which is the desire to get rid of what you don't like. And so people oftentimes ask me, how do I get rid of anger? People say I'm an angry person. How can I get rid of anger? So I say, it's not a matter of getting rid of it, it's of understanding. Anger, greed, delusion, confusion, jealousy, fear, these are human emotions we all have. And the desire to annihilate them is Vipavadana, where seeing them in terms of Dhamma, being able to reflect on them and know them as conditions arising and ceasing is liberation.
Luego existen tres formas de deseo. Los deseos básicos, que son los que nos vienen por el cuerpo, lo que podemos llegar a ellos viendo algo, por los ojos. Otros son las ambiciones que uno puede tener, aunque podemos tener también ambiciones que son buenas, ser un buen principiante. Y están los deseos de los que no nos gustan. Está el enojo, está la codicia, está la envidia, algunos de los ejemplos que él dio. Y debemos entonces ver estas cosas, pero verlas de acuerdo al Dhamma. Y si vemos las cosas de acuerdo al Dhamma, de acuerdo que es la enseñanza del Buda, nos podemos liberar de estos deseos, de estos apegos, que nos, entre comillas, son los que nos causan sufrimiento.
So then the statement in the scripture, in the sutta, is the origin or the cause of suffering is due to this ignorant grasping of desire. And the second aspect, what to do about it, is to let go. The inside is letting go of desire. And that is then to be realized in our lives. The more you understand desire, you can't let go of something you don't know you're attached to. But with mindfulness, you're aware of the desire to get something you don't have yet. It could be desire for some position in society, or desire for getting concentration, samadhi, or whatever. A desire for becoming, for getting something, and then the desire for getting rid of. These need to be recognized as conditions. As we develop wisdom, we begin to see them as conditions arising and ceasing, rather than personal problems. In other words, we tend to see them as personal problems, the ordinary person. But from the wisdom level, they're not personal. They are sankharas, they are conditions that arise and cease. And this is reiterated over and over again, that sape sankhara anicca, all conditions are impermanent.
Luego, el segundo gran aspecto mencionado al inicio, en este caso, es dejar ir el deseo y darse cuenta, comprenderlo. Y uno lo puede hacer a través de la atención plena. Y hay distintos deseos, apegos que uno tiene. Por ejemplo, tener una posición social, o él menciona samatha, que es hacer meditación, pero meditación de concentración, no meditación de introspección, que sería el insight. Y no ver estas cosas como algo personal, como problemas personales, estos apegos que uno tiene. Porque verlos con sabiduría implica comprender que las cosas surgen y cesan, y que finalmente todo es impermanente.
And that's what mindfulness, attention playing, allows us to do, is to desire enough to get rid of it, but as you understand it, it comes and goes, it's not permanent. And your relation, when there is mindfulness and intuitive awareness, then you can actually see desire as what we call aramana, or a mental object, rather than as something just to react to. So the Buddha is developing this Buddha knowing Dhamma. This is the paradigm or the style of the Buddha to know things as they are, is to know desire as sankhara rather than seeing it in terms of personal identity, which we tend to do, or just react to it with grasping or trying to suppress it. Because there's two ways we deal with it, either blindly following it or trying to get rid of it.
Entonces, la atención plena no significa evitar las cosas, sino dejarlas ir y comprender que las realidades son impermanentes. Hay objetos que son solo objetos mentales, y la comprensión del Dhamma significa observar las cosas tal cual son.
So this, again, this emphasis on mindfulness is the way to understand. And I use the word intuitive awareness for sampajanya. It's like complete comprehension, the reality of this moment, and not focused on one thing, but including everything. Like we really pay attention to one thing, like the person, or like paying attention to me, I hope, or listening to the talk. But also there's with sampajanya, there's the ability to include the whole atmosphere, the ambience of this particular moment. That is what we call sampajanya.
Él habló de un concepto que es sapatanya, en Pali, y es para enfatizar el concepto de atención plena, que es una forma de entender y una forma de comprender que es intuitiva y acerca de esta habilidad de comprender cuál es la atmósfera de las cosas.
So in order to let go of desire, you have to know what desire is, and this is where the Second Noble Truth is very important to observe what is kama, that desire through senses. That's quite obvious. Seeing, we see something we like and we want it. That's kama tanha, or with the ear, with the nose, with the tongue, with the body. We want the pleasant, the beautiful, the pleasing, and then we don't want what isn't so. So that's vibhavadana, desire to run away, deny, get rid of. And this knowing, then, the sati sampajanya, allows us to see desire as a mind object rather than as something personal or something good or bad. It's not judging. Like sati sampajanya isn't about whether it's right or wrong, good or bad. It's knowing it is what it is in the present moment, and it is sankhara, and all sankharas are impermanent.
Entonces, para dejar ir el deseo o el apego, primero está el observar y poner atención en las cosas placenteras que uno conoce a través de los sentidos. Sentido escuchar lo que nos gusta, oler lo que nos gusta, sentir lo que es agradable. ¿Y qué pasa con lo que no es agradable? Lo que es antisant. Verlo tal cual es. Y que no hay que juzgarlo, que hay que observarlo en este momento presente y comprender que es algo impermanente.
The insight, letting go, then is meditation practice. First you have to know what attachment is, what attachment to desire, is what we generally do in one form or another, either through grasping or through rejecting. But as we, with Sati Sampajanya, we're becoming aware of that, seeing that the results of grasping or trying to control everything because of fear and desire, then we become obsessed with controlling ourselves or the world around us. It's through fear, through ignorance. But as we develop the insight into these three kinds of desires, when we see that letting go is not getting rid of, it's not annihilating, it's just relaxing. Like the fist is holding on, it's tight, it's tense, and you say, you're very tense, Ajahn Sumedho, relax, I just let go. I'm not cutting my hand off, I'm just relaxing the hand. So letting go isn't about control anymore, it's just letting things be what they are.
Entonces, la introspección sobre el dejar ir estos apegos no es acerca de rechazar los apegos, ni intentar controlarlo todo, yo o las cosas, nosotros mismos. Y dejar ir está vinculado a relajarse. Y si tengo algo en la mano, no es cortarse la mano, sino observarlo tal cual es.
So in my early monastic life, when I was training with Luang Por Chah in Phuborn in northeast Thailand, this was a practice of letting go, just learning to adapt to monastic life. It's very strict in its discipline, had to learn a new, integrate into a totally new culture, new climate, new expectations, and so there's a lot of confusion and frustration in the first couple of years of my monastic life. This frustration, this confusion, this learning another language, not understanding what they're talking about. Oftentimes the American mind, Americans are very idealistic and critical, so you think Americans would do it a different way. You let go of everything and just adapt to the way it's done in the monastery. And then you begin to experience an inner peace of where you can't, as long as you're trying to compare northeast Thailand with Seattle, Washington. It doesn't work, and then you're in a totally different environment. But the master, Ajahn Chah, was an exceptionally wise monk. And so one couldn't help but trust him. There was an intuitive feeling an innate feeling of trust and respect that developed my relationship to Luang Por Chah. Yeah, him himself, I began to, even though in many things I couldn't understand with the language, I developed trust.
Luego, en su vida monástica más temprana, que se desarrolló en el norte de Tailandia, él tuvo como maestro al maestro Ajahn Chah y tenía diferentes objetivos. Uno era adaptarse a la vida monástica, a una disciplina que era muy estricta, pero a la vez a una nueva cultura y a otro idioma. Entonces estaba muy frustrado, estaba confundido porque no podía entender, y además se agregaba el hecho de que él pensaba como norteamericano, una persona de Seattle que estaba en Tailandia, y en un ambiente totalmente diferente. Él tenía un maestro que era Yan Cha, que era una persona extremadamente sabia, y él en el que tuvo que respetar y confiar, desarrollar la confianza en este maestro que él tenía.
So the insight, letting go, the second noble truth, and then you through Sati Sampajanya you recognize the insight, let go of it, not annihilate, not about annihilating, but releasing that blind, tense hold we have on our desires, or the fear of desire, or rejection of desire. The desire to get rid of desire is also Vipavadana. You let go of everything, and what's left is the third noble truth, the end of suffering. You begin to recognize that suffering is the condition, it arises, ceases, but ultimately all forms of suffering, all conditions take you to non-suffering, to Dhamma, to reality.
Entonces, el origen del sufrimiento, que es el segundo concepto sobre la noble verdad, la segunda noble verdad, está en comprender el deseo y el sufrimiento, y ese miedo que uno le tiene al apego a las cosas y que las quiere evitar, y uno tiene que aprender a dejarlas ir, y dejar ir todo. La tercera noble verdad es que todas las formas de sufrimiento devienen en Dhamma. Y en este caso Dhamma lo está empleando como realidad última, el concepto de Dhamma, o Dharma en sánscrito, como realidad última.
So the third noble truth then is called Nirodha, the end of the cessation of suffering. And that is where you see the path, the Eightfold Path. You know from insight, from what they in Pali Jnana Dasana, or inside knowledge. You know, in America we say gut knowledge. It's from deep down. It's not just knowing about something. And you know the path, and that is the entrance into the path of the stream enterer, where we begin to recognize, to know the path in a very clear way, and that is to be developed or made clear. Our way of life then is through increasing this mindfulness, this reflectiveness, which leads to the fourth noble truth, right understanding, samadhi, which then follows in tandem sama sangapo, sama vaja, sama gamanto, sama chivo, sama vayamo, sama sati, sama samadhi. These are the eight folds of this path, based on right or perfect understanding of Dhamma, which lead onward to, we in terms of how we relate to the world, we right speech, right action, right livelihood. And then the last aspect is the samadhi, the balance, emotional balance of sama vayamo, sama sati, sama samadhi. And so this is what one cultivates. It makes it sound complicated, eight folds, but it's very, very simple. It's through insight that you know for sure. It's not theoretical anymore.
Entonces la tercera noble verdad es la cesación del sufrimiento, y eso nos lleva a ver este sendero, y la entrada obliga a verlo claramente. Y aquí viene enseguida la cuarta noble verdad, que es el camino del noble óctuple sendero. Yo se lo voy a leer porque son 8. Este sendero es el recto entendimiento, el recto pensamiento, el recto lenguaje, la recta acción, la recta vida, el recto esfuerzo, la recta atención y el que, en el cual puso énfasis, que es la recta concentración, que es hacer un balance of emotion, poner, ¿cómo lo traducimos? El equilibrio de las emociones. Dice que parece súper complicado que sean 8, pero que es simple.
So, covering the Four Noble Truths in 45 minutes, I would like to open up the rest of the time for any questions that you have, you'd like to ask.
Entonces dice que, bueno, explicar el noble óctuple sendero en 45 minutos, bueno, es un reto, y ahora lo que él quiere es escuchar las preguntas que ustedes tengan de este noble óctuple sendero y de las 4 nobles verdades que ha expuesto hoy.
I am sorry, I'm down and I have to go out. Could you please repeat the eighth path? Which are the steps of the eighth path?
In English, it's right understanding, right intention. That's samaditi samasangapo. And then samavaja is right speech. Manto is right action. Ativo is right livelihood. So that, like, with right understanding of Dhamma, you know Dhamma, not just some idea in your head anymore.
Okay.
You know how you live your life then. You know, your daily life is based on right action, right speech, right livelihood. And then that leads to samadhi, or right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, or it's like emotional balance or equanimity.
Okay, thank you.
Rather, you know, when you're just dealing with feelings and person, you know, love and hate, like and dislike, then you have no equanimity, always moving some kind of agitation of the mind.
Yeah.
But as you let go of that, the causes of that, then there's equanimity. Upekkha.
Sí, bueno, ella nos preguntó que si podían repetir el noble óctuple sendero. Entonces le dice, es el recto entendimiento, utiliza las palabras en pali y en inglés de recto entendimiento, recto pensamiento, recto lenguaje, recta acción, recta vida, recto esfuerzo, recta atención y recta concentración. Respecto de la primera parte de este sendero, el recto entendimiento es entender las cosas, pero en la vida diaria, cómo yo llevo mi vida en el día a día. Entender eso. Y la recta ecuanimidad desarrolla esta idea de la recta ecuanimidad, que uno lidia con las cosas en términos de positivo o negativo, de amor y odio, y que en el fondo uno tiene que desarrollar una ecuanimidad frente a esas cosas, no ni lo uno ni lo otro, y dejarlo ir, to let it go.
Any other questions?
Preguntas nomás.
Do you have any special advice for people who do not have the luck of having spent 60 years in monastic environment, by monastic life, having very busy life in a city of 8 million, and in their meditation attempts, always struggling with all sorts of distractions, mental objects passing.
Would you say that in Spanish?
My Spanish is non-existent. That's why I ask in English. I'm not Chilean.
Bueno, él preguntó si con los 60 años de entrenamiento que tiene como monje, ¿qué consejito, no así, pero qué consejo le daría? Desde una persona que está siempre viajando, que ha conocido mucho y por lo tanto sabe lo que es desconcentrarse.
Don't despair.
Que no se desespere.
I mean, it's you know, I've been very fortunate, and I recognize that. But the actual teaching is based on what I've been talking about, the First Noble Truth. And as people develop more awareness, it's important to trust your ability to be aware, to recognize the value, the importance of awareness or attention plane or mindfulness, because even though you are mindful, you wouldn't have been able to survive if you weren't mindful. And it's not something that when we're mindful of things, of objects, or when life is in danger, we're very mindful. Or you're playing sports, or you have to be mindful when you're doing something that takes that ability to know where things are in the present. But in ordinary life, city life, for example, you know, one becomes totally neurotic with fears as you're in your modern condominium with locked doors and air conditioning. You can be suicidal because of thinking and fears that aren't immediate to the situation. And and so it's important now to trust more the ability to just be aware in daily life, even though you know you think you should be aware all the time. Just the moments that you remember this, be grateful for that. It's learning to be content and grateful for very small things rather than big attainments or achievements.
No. Bueno, desarrollar la atención plena para todo momento. O sea, uno puede estar practicando deporte y desarrollar atención plena en el momento en que está practicando deporte o haciendo cualquier cosa. Y también desarrollar confianza. Uno puede vivir, por ejemplo, en un condominio moderno, con rejas, con alarma, y aún así tenerle miedo a las cosas. Entonces, poner atención en la vida diaria y estar agradecido. Y estar agradecido de las cosas chicas, no solamente de los grandes logros que uno haya tenido, sino de las cosas pequeñas, the small things. Si pueden decir su nombre.
Mi nombre es Carlos. Te quería preguntar cómo a través de la respiración, considerando que la respiración es la expresión más clara donde se debaten las dos polaridades en el ser humano en términos de, por un lado, la influencia de la mente y por otro lado la influencia de lo metabólico y por lo tanto de las funciones y deseos del ser humano, cómo a través del control de la respiración nosotros podemos llegar a este punto medio, a este punto de ecuanimidad que necesitamos para el desarrollo de la atención plena.
He said how through breathing we could develop meditation, mindfulness. At the same moment, through breathing, since in breathing we we have on the one hand the influence of our mind, and on the other hand the influence of metabolic,
Sí, la parte física.
see,
The senses.
the senses, the desires, how to attain the middle way in breathing.
Well, this is a miracle of Buddhist teaching, because I mean, sometimes I would feel there's no way out of the trap. You've got this human body, and it's always in some state where it's hungry or too hot, too cold, and tired and whatnot, and it has its desires, and then you have your personal habits, your ego, the sense of yourself is developed from childhood, and cultural biases, cultural conditioning. We all have, been influenced by the culture, by the ethnic background we're from, by the religion that we're brought up in. These are affecting consciousness. And then the language. Language is a human-created tool, so it's, we're thinking, we like to think, we like to have definitions and define and describe things as good or bad, right or wrong. But these are all conditioned phenomena, and that awareness, like consciousness, when a baby is born, it has no ego yet. It has no cultural bias. It has no language. But it has a human form. It has survival intelligence, and it is conscious, a fully conscious human form. And then after birth, it's usually the mother is the first influence. So your mother points out how to, when you're a good baby or a bad baby, or you're a boy or a girl, or and so these influence the sense of yourself, and your ego grows as you grow up in a society like in the United States, very competitive society based on, even though it's about freedom and equality, it's about winners, and the one you want to be is the best. And so you've got these influences in how you interpret experience, and where with mindfulness and wisdom, training yourself, informing consciousness with wisdom, then you're in touch with the universal reality. It's outside. It's no longer distorted through conventional cultural biases or religious biases or the limitation of a language or the ego. So it is. There's this consciousness is not created by human ignorance. It's here and now, and that's where mindfulness allows this consciousness. We become more aware of the pure consciousness when we let go of the conditions that arise and cease in it. I hope you can translate.
La traducción corta es que todo surge y cesa. Pero dice, bueno, esto precisamente lo que dijiste tú es el milagro de la enseñanza budista. Uno tiene estados, por ejemplo, que tengo frío, que tengo calor, que estoy enojado. Y uno tiene hábitos que son personales, y desde que uno es niño, a uno lo crían en el concepto del yo, del ego. Y hay condiciones culturales, que son religiosas, que son étnicas, y una es el lenguaje. El lenguaje es el que crea las herramientas, y a nosotros nos gusta pensar Y cuando pensamos nos gusta tener definiciones. Y desarrollar la conciencia es difícil, pero pone el ejemplo de un bebé, una guagua. Entonces la guagua, cuando está chica, no tiene conciencia del yo, pero tiene una forma humana. Y le van a decir pronto, eres un niñito, eres una niñita, o eres un niñito malo, una niñita mala. Son palabras de él, no mías. Y uno se deja influenciar por la cultura. Y por ejemplo, ¿qué influencia cultural hay en el caso de Estados Unidos? El de andar compitiendo. Y ahí viene la sabiduría y la atención plena, que nos permite ver que si uno tiene un apego, es un apego a la realidad última. Y esto se desarrolla a través de la conciencia, y una conciencia que no es la mente ignorante la que entiende esto. Y que todo surge, y que nos permite comprender que todo surge y cesa.
¿Ah? Una pregunta fácil. Y en español. No sé si es fácil, pero no, en nuestro país, en Occidente en general, las personas que estamos cercanas al budismo, los que son budistas, ¿sí? Nos encontramos, por supuesto, muchas veces con personas profundamente cristianas y que nos consultan qué es el budismo. Y en lo personal siempre tengo un conflicto entre respetar su creencia y no perturbar su vida espiritual, que es su camino, o tratar de mostrarle lo que para mí ha sido bastante bueno, positivo y enriquecedor. Entonces me gustaría saber la opinión al respecto.
Pero la opinión de qué?
De-
No, sí, pero la pregunta concreta.
La opinión, ¿qué se hace en ese caso?
¿Qué se dice?
¿Ah? Porque claro, yo estoy frente a una persona que me pregunta sobre budismo. Yo sé que es una persona profundamente cristiana, que no tiene ningún conflicto con su espiritualidad, pero que quiere realmente conocer. Y por otro lado, la mayoría de nosotros, si no todos, como ex cristianos, en algún sentido, ¿ah? conocemos las razones por las cuales nos hemos retirado de ese camino, ¿ah? y la riqueza que nos ofrece la visión budista. Pero entregar eso a esa persona puede causarle un problema, a mi juicio, lo cual me impide a mí expresarme con naturalidad. Me gustaría saber cuál es el consejo. ¿Qué se hace?
He's looking for an advice. And he has a dilemma. The dilemma is about in our country or in the West countries, we hear what to really say and not to disturb the path they are following. Because he said, many of us who are in Buddhism right now, we do understand why we left Christianity. So my dilemma is, your dilemma is, his dilemma. How not to disturb when answering what Buddhism is about.
Well, it's because I think, well, I was brought up as a Christian, and I lived in England as a Buddhist monk for 34 years, and they have a very strong, in London, they have a very strong interfaith movement. now Britain has become multicultural, multi-religious, so there's so many Hindus, Muslims, Jews, and you name it, there's every possible form of religion. And so this interfaith movement was organized back in the 70s, I think, to meet the need, and I was part of that. And so there's a very, in England, it's incredibly tolerant toward other religions. So I've never had any problems. In fact, like the Catholic, Roman Catholic monks and nuns sometimes would attend Buddhist meditation retreats, because we're not addressing things from the same level. Like Catholicism is theistic, like Christianity is theistic, so it starts, I believe in God, is the creed, you know, so that is the first thing, where Buddha never affirmed or denied God. So it's not, some people think Buddhism is atheism, but it's not, because the Buddha never addressed the question of God, but of the common experience of dukkha, of suffering. And he put it on that level, it's not a threat, because if you're a Catholic or a Muslim or Buddhist, the suffering is pretty much the same thing. And so many Catholics have practiced some form of Zen Buddhism or Vipassana, Vipassana practices taken from Buddhism, because it deals with everyday life, with the problem of being human and understanding it. But it's not a denial of, you know, so we talk about Dhamma, which has no, you know, like Dhamma is ultimate reality, and that's ultimately what religions see as God. You know, whatever you call it, that's what they are referring to. But Buddha never formed any image, never used anthropomorphic forms. Dhamma, to represent Dhamma, you have a wheel, you know, it's a kind of symbol, Dhamma wheel. But Dhamma can be realized, and this is what the Four Noble Truths do, is they take you to that realization of Dhamma, knowing it directly, not just believing that someday you'll find Dhamma. You know it. It's what you really are. It's your true nature, is Dhamma. So, we don't disparage other religions, but you know, because I've developed my life through Buddhism, this is what I know, and through Christian mysticism or Christian practice, I've never developed that, so I can't very well speak on those issues. But you can respect them, you know. I don't have strong views about, you know, anti-religious views at all. But just encourage, like, for me to give a talk, a Dhamma, I have to be asked, so I can't, it's not a, Buddhism is not about converting, you know, not about me telling you what you should do, or forcing you to become a Buddhist, but it's if you're interested, then you ask, and then I can discuss it. So it's a non-threatening religion. It's a religion, it's science, it's ultimately scientific, because you can prove it, you know, but Western science tends to be empirical, going outward, you know, you're looking at the world from, as an object out there, where they haven't really taken it in to here, you know, to where you actually create the world in your mind. So that's what Buddha did with science. The English word science means knowledge, and then it's psychology, it's religion, it's philosophy, it fills all those categories. Is somebody talking there?
That's another question.
Algo así. Yo le explicaba que era algo así. Sí, bien. Ya, entonces... Te lo voy a decir en primera persona porque lo dijo así. Viví 44 años como budista en un país budista que era el Reino Unido. Hoy el Reino Unido es un país multicultural e interreligioso. Y este movimiento se inicia en los años 70 y yo fui parte de este movimiento interreligioso. Aunque el concepto es interfaith, es como interfe, no es lo mismo. Y en el Reino Unido, que es un país muy tolerante, habían católicos que acudían a retiros budistas. Y el Buda jamás afirmó ni negó la existencia de un Dios. Y el concepto principal del budismo, que es por qué uno sufre, es algo que está presente en las demás religiones también. Y si bien las otras religiones te hablan de Dios, en el budismo te habla de la realidad última, que es el Dhamma. Uno explica las religiones a través de formas antropomórficas, con cosas humanas, pero el budismo te lo expresa con una rueda que tiene 8 puntas. Y eso significa, ¿por qué son 8? Porque uno tiene que puede alcanzar este camino de conocer la realidad última a través de la realización del noble octuple sendero. Y que significa entender lo que tú eres, cuál es tu naturaleza. Entonces, y yo he vivido así. No he vivido como en otras religiones, he vivido como budista. Y el budismo no es acerca de convertir a los demás, porque no es una religión, al contrario, es una ciencia, y una ciencia que puede ser probada. Y por eso parte de sus componentes son la psicología y la filosofía. Mencionó más, pero no lo recuerdo. En tanto en una religión hay cosas que tú creas en tu mente y están ahí. Es un mundo mental. Perdón, ahí y luego tú.
Sí, me pasa algo bien...
¿Tu nombre?
Yo me llamo Cris. Lo que pasa es que se menciona que lo ideal es dejar como el deseo y los apegos, pero es algo que lo considero tan difícil en la sociedad actual, en el mundo en que vivimos, que muchos días pasan tan rápido que con suerte comemos. Ya no nos relacionamos con personas, no conversamos, no nos miramos, es como pasar y pasan los días y uno no crece, uno no aprende nada y tratar de llevar a cabo todas estas ideas, de desarrollarlas, se hace tan difícil, o al menos a mí, que es como una rueda sin fin, porque mientras uno lo intenta, el día a día te gana y te llegan las cuentas y hay que pagar cosas y que los niños a la escuela y un montón de cosas. Entonces tiende a ser algo tan difícil. Entonces, ¿qué opción a lo mejor es la más fácil? A través de la meditación, a través de estudiar más, darse el tiempo aunque no exista. ¿Cuál sería como el consejo, como un camino más real para los que no estamos tan insertos en el desarrollo del budismo y todo eso?
this goal of let it go, desires and attachments is so hard, so difficult. Days go so fast. We even don't know each other. We don't have time to attain these goals. So it seems like it is daily life unended wheel. We have to pay the bills, we have to take care of the children. So these goals of let it go, not to be attached, is so difficult. What other options would we find easier and real for the ones who are not so close to Buddhism? What Buddhism proposes?
Well, encouraging you to be mindful, and like if you have a busy life, it's always good to take time out just to relax and let go, because like the tendency to get wound up and just until you burn out, so you're so busy, then you go from one thing to another. So taking the time out in the day just to relax, to do some kind of basic meditation, mindfulness of the breath, or whatever you learn, just to do that for 5 minutes or 15 minutes. That it's like it integrates into your life to stop the habitual momentum of getting caught up without any relief from it till you actually just burn out from exhaustion. So it's, there's so many ways. It can look impossible, living, with a family, having children, and a job, and things like this. But it's not impossible. It's a compliment. And I talk to university students a lot who get caught into very intense, obsessive needs to, where they just burn out, or because of the stress of examination. And I say, look, meditation is like balancing. It's not, you don't have to give up your studies, but learning to balance, not to just get blindly obsessed with trying to get everything done on time. To take time out just for Dhamma, for relaxation. Ajahn Chah, one time I asked him, because I was, my first year, I'm an intensely willful character, and used a lot of willfulness and force in my practice. So I asked him about meditation, and he said that meditation is a holiday of the heart. And I thought, holiday of the heart? That's not holiday, it's hard work. But it changed the way I was doing it was making it hard work. And this way, where I encourage you to see it as a holiday of the heart, rather than just another thing you should be doing. It's seen it as a balance and complement to your daily life.
Bueno, dice que para animarte frente a una vida súper ocupada, te tienes que relajar y darte un tiempo. Él habla, si puede ser 5 minutos, 15 minutos, pero darte un momento para detenerte. Dice que parece imposible, pero que no es imposible. Él les decía a unos estudiantes universitarios que estaban súper estresados, que estaban súper atareados, que meditaran, porque la meditación nos permite balancearnos y tener una vida que no sea estresarse, para llegar a este Dhamma, a esta realidad última. Su maestro Ajahn Chah lo observaba, que él cuando meditaba se ponía, ¿cómo traducir esto? Le ponía tanto esfuerzo y le dijo, si meditar es como tener vacaciones mentales. Entonces le cambió esta forma de ver la meditación no como algo que te estresaba aún más, sino darse una vacación, darse un momento de veraneo.
¿Qué hacer para que el sendero no se transforme en una definición más sofisticada del ego, de la personalidad, en el fondo? Porque Buda no era budista. Buda se conectó con una forma de recorrer un camino de autoconocimiento y de conexión profunda con la esencia, con el ser. Entonces, ¿qué hacer para evitar que se transforme en una nueva definición de una personalidad más sofisticada? En esta situación de definirse como algo.
It's a very complicated question. How not to make the path another more sophisticated definition of the self one. Because Buddha himself, which was not a Buddhist, he connected with a deep way of being. So this Noble Eightfold Path, it could be a more complicated thing of the ego, definition of the ego.
Well, it's like the ego, yeah. For you to be a person, for you to operate from the ego, you have to think. The ego depends on thinking. And this is important where the path is not about thinking, it's about knowing. And the ego, when you have to think, I am this body, this is me, and then you become a person. Or I am this way, I'm a good person or bad person. Or then you create the ego, the sense of yourself as a physical form, as an emotional being, and all your fears and desires and tendencies are personified, are made personal through attachment to thinking. And thinking is one of the, attachment to thinking always leads to doubt. You try to find the Eightfold Path on the ego level, you'll never be sure you've got it. Thinking inevitably leads to doubt, the attachment to thinking. So that's where letting go of thinking and trusting in, like Sati Sampajanya, isn't about thinking, it's about attention. And learning to trust that. Then your knowledge of the path comes from wisdom rather than from thinking, is this the path or not? As long as you're thinking about it, you'll never be quite sure what it is.
El ego surge cuando uno se pone a pensar, y este sendero no es acerca de andar pensando, sino de conocer, de ir conociendo. Cuando uno se pone a pensar, uno crea el yo, el ego, y ahí vienen los deseos y uno de los apegos, varios apegos, y uno es el apego a pensar. Y este apego es sobre andar dudando de todo. Entonces, uno, en vez de andar dudando de todo, tiene que confiar. Y uno tiene que confiar en el desarrollo de la atención plena para desarrollar sabiduría. Y no ponerse a pensar. Sí, por favor.
Yo soy Alejandro. ¿Qué relación establece el budismo entre el sufrimiento y el miedo? ¿Qué es que después sufro porque tengo miedo de sufrir?
So, what's, from a Buddhist perspective, what's the relationship between suffering and fear? Which is first? Do I suffer because I feel fear, or I feel fear because I'm suffering? Which is first?
Fear is like, it's primal, there's a lot to fear actually, you know, so, because you're living, you know, your physical body is very vulnerable. You know, when you grab the door, you could be hit by a car. Just law of the jungle, where we live in Thailand, is next to a big animal sanctuary, the wild animals, and that's all about fear. Law of the jungle is. So fear is primal to the being mammals, having human bodies, having animal bodies. Fear is a protective emotion that when you sense fear, you do something to get away from it. And then neurotic fear, where like in your apartment, with the locked door, then you can imagine all kinds of other things that are flying down. And that's more neurotic fear, because it's not based on reality around you, but on possibilities of things that, you know, are unpredictable in the future. But that which knows fear, you can be aware of fear, intelligence, but the neurotic fears we can let go of. You know, they're not. We needn't suffer from unnecessarily creating possibilities, because the possibilities for failure, for suffering, for sickness, for death, or, you know, we can live in a world of fear, of possibilities of losing everything. But with mindfulness, then we see through that, we let go of it. And so like neurotic fear just drops away. And actually, in reality, there's nothing to fear. Absolutely nothing. Which is hard to understand when you're identified with the sankharas, with the conditions, with the body, with your mental conditioning.
Él dice, bueno, el miedo, hay mucho miedo. Hay mucho miedo, por ejemplo, que le pase algo a tu cuerpo, o a tu auto, que le pase, o por ejemplo, ellos viven en la jungla, en Tailandia, y hay animales alrededor, y uno le tiene miedo a esos animales. Entonces, el miedo es primario, y es una condición protectora. En los mamíferos, y como los humanos somos mamíferos, también. Y está el miedo que es neurótico, que es la posibilidad de predecir cosas futuras, pero que no son reales. Entonces uno puede liberarse y ahí está el sufrimiento. Y el sufrimiento es de cosas que son reales. Y en realidad no hay nada a que tenerle miedo. Y... ¿sabes que aquí no entiendo yo la letra?
El miedo
Could you repeat the last part of it? fear about suffering, please.
Well,
Of suffering.
suffering is attachment to fear. So, and then I mean, like if a tiger is chasing you, that kind of fear is survival. You know, something realistic, and you don't think about it. You just, you just spontaneously do something to get away. That's natural kind of situation. Where sitting in your apartment tonight worrying about a tiger attaching you, it would be neurotic fear. And that's what we let go of, So you're still capable of dealing with environmental situations or, the natural world we live in is about birth and death. Everything is changing. And when you think about it, without wisdom, then it's scary because you think, there's nothing you can trust. Life is just, by chance, and one can become very cynical or very frightened by the thought that everything's changing and there's no stability. But that's thinking again. You have to think about it and see it in terms of a negation, rather than just trusting in awareness. When you trust in awareness with mindfulness, then you're in tune with ultimate reality. That's your real refuge, your Dhamma, which is deathless. It's not about, it doesn't come and go. It's here all the time. It's just, you forget it or you don't notice it.
El sufrimiento es un apego al miedo, y está el miedo a las cosas de sobrevivencia, y eso es realista, pero no así los miedos que son neuróticos, y uno se puede poner a pensar, por ejemplo, que todo cambia, pero ahí uno está pensando. Y cuando uno piensa no desarrolla la atención plena. Y en tanto, si desarrollas la atención plena y no piensas, puedes entender la realidad última de las cosas. Nombre.
Cristian.
Miembro de Sandoz.
En Occidente se entiende mucho cuando uno habla de amor como un sinónimo de apego. De relaciones donde hay mucho apego.
¿Amor? ¿Qué tipo de amor?
Amor en general, amor de pareja, amor hacia los padres, amor ¿Cómo uno puede amar a sus padres, a sus parejas, a sus hijos, sin caer en apego? Te quería complicar un poquito.
Daily life. Okay. The last question and we finish. Okay. Yeah. So this is going to be the last question and answer. Christian asks for love. Daily life is about love. Love to parents, love to my partner, to my couple, to my wife, to my husband. But Buddhism teaches that you don't have to be attached. How to develop a not attached love.
Well, that's where you begin to see the suffering of, like love, the English word, is used for liking, I like hamburgers, or I love hamburgers, and things like that. We use it for, and then there's romantic love where you fall in love with somebody, and then there's unconditional love, like in Christianity, where that's more the Buddhist approach, like metta, bhavana. You have these four divine, they're called the four divine abodes, metta, karuna, upeka, mudita, upeka. And metta is translated as loving kindness. And it's more in the sense of like unconditional love. It's not about liking anymore. So when we practice metta, we spread metta or loving kindness to all sentient beings, whether the bad ones, the good ones. It's unconditional. And that is an attitude. I mean, love is what holds everything together. Hate is what divides, you know, so when love is why we're together, and then when we hate each other, we separate. And that's just the law of nature. And but love can, you know, without love, then, you know, there's, you know, we wouldn't be able to live together. We wouldn't be able to understand each other. And then in Buddhism, it's like there's a lot of emphasis on gratitude, being grateful to parents, to teachers. It's about respect and gratitude, and this applies also to metta, and then we have the second one is karuna, which is compassion. How we feel like when you see you hear news about you know, children being bombed to death in Syria, you feel compassion. Even if it's not true, you just seen a headline in a newspaper one day about like 12 children being killed in a bombing attack, and I felt this compassion, this sense of sadness and compassion for children I didn't even know, and maybe it wasn't true, I don't know, but this is how the human mind is. It's not cold like the enlightened mind. It's not like a cold zombie, and you just don't love your wife anymore, and you're indifferent to your children. And your relationship changes to a much, you know, deeper level of selfless compassion and joy at the goodness and beauty of life, mudita. And then upeka is equanimity. So, like metta and upeka are refuges for us when we don't always think in terms of metta, but as we develop the path, we have more upeka, which isn't a cold-hearted indifference to life, but just an emotional balance in which we can generate quite spontaneously metta, karuna, mudita.
No, en inglés se emplea el amor para decir que uno ama algo, le gustan las cosas, está el amor entre pareja también, y está el amor incondicional, que es la correspondencia con el amor cristiano. Y ahí aparece el concepto, el utilizar la palabra pali, y que se puede traducir como amor benevolente, el deseo del bien sobre los demás. Y que ya ese amor, este deseo de amor benevolente, ya no es acerca de si me gustan algo o acerca de los buenos y los malos, eso desaparece, porque metta no divide, el amor benevolente no divide, y eso es lo que nos permite vivir juntos. Y esto está ligado a sentirse agradecido, a poder enseñarnos entre nosotros, a respetarnos y amar, pero amar con este deseo de amor benevolente que es para todos. Y aquí él une otro concepto que es el de karuna, que es el de la compasión, que es la capacidad de ponerse en el lugar del otro. Si él cita, si yo sé, aunque no sea real, que unos niños murieron por una bomba, el ataque de una bomba, yo voy a sufrir, me voy a sentir mal. Desarrollo esta compasión y esta empatía. Y que esto no es, el amor no es de un zombie frío, que sería como el de las primeras dos formas de amor. Y aquí surge otro concepto que es el de la ecuanimidad. Y todo esto, la ecuanimidad, la compasión y el amor benevolente, uno lo toma como refugio. Andando así.
So I hope that this discussion, this talk this evening has increased your faith, confidence in Buddhism. And that's what I meant to do, is to encourage you all on this path, because it is, it's practical and it's very worthy, and I see it as a fulfillment of life, just as you develop and you trust yourself more, you begin to understand the problems of the society you're in a better way, and just increase in understanding both in a personal and a universal way. So I offer all my best wishes, blessings to you all.
Sí, bueno, nos da bendiciones, los mejores deseos. Dice que que meditar es lo que, en el fondo, el resumen de todo lo que dijo fue con muchas cosas. Era comprender cómo esto nos puede servir en la vida diaria. En Asia, uno al final no aplaude, uno da las gracias diciendo una fórmula que es sadhu, que es la forma de aplaudir porque uno está contento y uno lo dice 3 veces. Entonces los invito a decir sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos nuevamente la presencia general
Sí, yes.
y los quería invitar a tomar un vaso de jugo. Sí.
Todos aquellos que quieran apoyar, porque ellos, como les dije, son monjes renunciantes, si tienen 1.000 pesos, 5.000 o lo que sea, dólares, algo, vamos a tener unos sobres que están ahí pasando, lo ponen ahí, que es la prenda que nosotros daríamos, pero si no tienen, no se inquieten, pueden ofrecer sus actos también. Y muchas gracias.